Go.
Mark D. Jensen, 2002, CF 314. The appearances are the same. The jury is back in the courtroom. Where are the phase of the defendant's closing argument? Mr. Perry, you can start whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Judge. I want to say how grateful I am that I'm able to stand here and speak to you all after these last few weeks. Things have not been presented exactly chronologically, or I think in the easiest to understand manner. We've had video testimony. Sometimes that's felt out of order, out of chronological order. Sometimes it's hard to hear. It'd be hard for anyone to catch everything that's been presented. Myself, Ms. Krause, Ms. Renner, and most of all, Mark Jensen, are so relieved to have such an obviously attentive and serious group of jurors. So thank you for that. Now, I'm not going to yell and shout about penis pictures. I don't yell and shout about really anything. During this trial, we've tried to be measured and analytical. And that's how I'm going to try to approach this as well. Because this man is charged with homicide. And emotional appeals that cloud the relevant evidence is not what's needed. In thinking about all the things that have been presented and trying to organize it, the photos, the harassment, the penis drawings, that was a lot of it. How much of it is actually relevant to the prosecution's allegation that Mark Jensen committed first-degree intentional homicide? I think a lot of it is meaningless. A lot of it serves no purpose other than an attempt to establish that Mark Jensen had pornography in 2002 on his computer that the prosecution has a problem with. Throughout this time that I have, I'm going to try to focus on what Mark Jensen is actually charged with and the relevant evidence regarding it. You heard the judge read the instructions, and I just want to touch on one of those instructions. Because in America, when you're charged with a crime, you have no burden of proving your innocence. It's the government that has to prove it before you can be found guilty. That's because you can guarantee you won't commit a crime, but you can never guarantee you won't be accused of one. And you've heard this jury instruction of the level of proof that's required when you're accused of a crime, beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury instruction does a couple of things. First, it tells you what a reasonable doubt is, and then in sort of a roundabout way, it tells you what beyond a reasonable doubt means. First, a reasonable doubt is, and you heard this, is a doubt based upon reason and common sense. The sort of doubt that would cause a person of ordinary prudence to pause or hesitate when called upon to act in the most important affairs of life. Pause or hesitate when called to act upon the most important affairs in life. What are the most important affairs of life? Is it buying a house? Is it choosing whether to trust somebody? Is it buying a car? If you're buying a house, at the home inspection, you see a hairline crack in the foundation. Do you pause or hesitate to have to need more information before you move forward? Because if you do, that's reasonable doubt. That's the standard in Wisconsin. And that instruction about the level of proof that the prosecution bears in this case before you can be convicted of a crime. What if you find out that your home inspector has a fraud conviction? Do you pause? So that's reasonable doubt. But what does beyond a reasonable doubt mean? First of all, it means nothing has given you any pause. But the instruction actually tells us what beyond a reasonable doubt means. It says you are not to search for doubt, you're to search for the truth. And that makes sense, because if you were to search for doubt, that would mean the defense carries some sort of burden. And we know that's not true. The entire burden is on the prosecution. It's the truth. Has the prosecution proven its case such that you're convinced its allegation is the actual truth? Because if there's something that gives you any pause or hesitation when considering the prosecution's allegation of what, when, where, why, how, that's reasonable doubt. And it's only when you can comfortably say there's no pause or hesitation that you can say that the prosecution has proven its allegation to be the truth. It's not guessing. It's not guessing at what you think may have happened. It's a careful analysis of whether the government has met its very high burden before a person in America can be convicted of a crime. Through the course of my time to talk with you, I want to talk about memory and how we all know how memories change. How they changed in this case. You saw that with witnesses testifying now, asked about their memories and what they testified to in 2008 and 2007, in 1998, maybe in 2002 when they were first interviewed by the investigators. How it was years before investigation even spoke to people in this case. How it was 9 years before some people even claimed they remembered anything. This trial has taken about 3 weeks. Wait and see when you go into deliberations if you all have the same memory of what each witness said. I want to talk about lies, because the centerpiece of the state's entire prosecution is a lie. And I want to talk about something called confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is when someone searches for and interprets information in a way that confirms or supports one's belief. It's not scientific. It's the opposite of scientific. It's not a process that results in a fair assessment of evidence. It's the opposite of fair. We see it in the states bending facts to science when it should be applying science to the facts. We see it in how Julie Jensen is described by the state. We see it in the systematic ignoring or pretending that certain facts just don't exist. We talked about things that cause you to pause or hesitate in the most important affairs of life. These are things that can cause more than just a pause. These are full stops. I want to mention a couple of things just out of the gate. There have been some, and this fits with what I've just talked about. There's this assertion that there's a high five when Mark came back to his house on December 4th. We talked with Detective Ratsberg at length about the handoff of that house on December 4th and the police that were there and all the observations of Mark Jensen. And you didn't hear anything about an observation of a high five and the timing of when this would have happened and it being late at night and how everything was being observed and recorded. This idea that Mark Jensen threw away her belongings. Now, I mean, I'm not going to be able to go through everything everyone said, and you're going to have to rely on your notes for some of these things. But the throwing away the belongings, when we dug into what does that mean, what was actually observed, very little. And very little knowledge or no knowledge at all about whether things were set out for a donation, what was in bags. Somebody recognized something that they thought may have belonged to Julie Jensen, and from that, this memory was created that, oh my God, Mark Jensen threw away all of Julie Jensen's things. Go back and look at what was actually said about that. He hated her, and that's what was going on. I mean, that's really, I'd say it's a lot more complicated. We heard just yesterday how Mark and his son were building a Christmas rod, a fishing rod for Christmas for Julie Jensen. Those day planner notes, and then combined with her later statements about how he's encouraging her to see a doctor. The investigation that was done in this case, you know, even the things found in that office, the box of zip drives, you know, nothing was fingerprinted. This theory, this idea that Julie Jensen never had anything to do with the computer. Just very little investigation that was done in most of these things. They weren't looking for ethylene glycol. This idea that it was hidden, or what was Mark Jensen doing on December 3rd? They weren't looking for ethylene glycol when they searched the house. Detective Ratsberg acknowledged that. He said, when we looked back at the video, yeah, I could see things in the garage that looked like probably antifreeze. They took the Playboys. They didn't take the antifreeze. I need to spend some time talking about Aaron Dillard. Aaron Dillard, Aaron Galvin, Kyle Rezick. I don't know who this person is. He's an actual con man. He's someone who has conned educated people out of their life's savings. He's an international con man. And he's never stopped his lying, and he's never stopped his deceit. How does a con man convince people to buy his stories? He blends facts with fiction so that it sounds possible. He tells people what they want to hear. He presents himself as a reasonable, well-spoken individual. I think you saw that in here. You saw how he presents himself. In Lithuania, these families wanted visas to America, so Aaron Dillard took their life savings, and he did that 7 times over. Think of the things that Aaron Dillard was willing to do for a few $100s or a few $1,000s. He lied about who he was. He defrauded companies. He bought check stock, created false companies, false payroll checks. He researched how to be a medical and surgical equipment seller in order to defraud Wendy Reamer, who believed his name was Kyle Rezick, over and over again. You heard Lori Brown. She was a lawyer and then an administrator of a law firm, a smart, educated woman. She got defrauded by Dillard. She described him as personable, knowledgeable, and that he instilled a lot of confidence. Her opinion? He's not a truthful or honest person. How about Deborah Teagle Spears? She testified in this case. She met Kyle Rezick. She lent him money. Eventually, she went into his wallet to find out what his real name is and ran a check on him. Do you remember what Miss Spears said about Dillard when asked about his character for truthfulness? She said, he has no character. He's a con man. He uses people for what he can get out of them. So on August 14th, 2007, when Aaron Dillard got to the Kenosha County Jail, what was he willing to do? He had been out on extended supervision and was coming back to court to determine how long he was going to go back to prison. He was AWOL from supervision. He got pulled over on May 31st, 2007. At that point, he hadn't reported to his agent since the previous October. When he got pulled over and he had a suspended registration, he lied to a police officer and said he was his brother, Mike Kaiser. And then while claiming to be Michael Kaiser, he blamed the suspended registration on his brother, Aaron Dillard. This is what he does. The police figured it out and he got charged with obstructing an officer. He had 17 violations while out on probation. He had cheated Dennis Ritt out of money. He told Dennis Ritt that he had a telecommunications company in Lithuania. He convinced him to lend him money, never paid him back. He wrote a check from a closed bank account to Dennis Ritt, knowing it's not good. He had defrauded Lori Brown. He had defrauded Cassandra Ivey. Cassandra Ivey had paid him $6,200 and had a construction contract with Dillard. For that, he got charged with theft by contractor and home improvement fraud. Dillard was facing 7 years on that case. For the reconfinement, he knew that his probation agent was recommending he get the maximum time available of 4.5 years. And it was an aggressive recommendation. I asked Aaron Dillard this when he was testifying, and he acknowledged, he said he was aware of the probation agent's justification for the maximum sentence. And I read it to him, and he remembered it. It is obvious that Mr. Dillard is in need of serious CGIP, but his criminal behavior is well beyond the need of cognitive thinking. His repetitive, deviant thinking is just in plain need of confinement. Even though prisons are normally used for rehabilitative purposes, Mr. Dillard is in desperate need of incarceration. It is the suggestion of this document that persons with criminal behavior of this caliber show no guilt or remorse. Their goal in life is to be a successful criminal. They are motivated by the power they feel to manipulate others, sometimes for material gain. So when he got to the Kenosha jail on August 14th, 2007, he was facing 9 months on that obstructing charge, 7 years on the theft by contractor, home improvement fraud case, and a recommendation of 4.5 years from his probation agent. What was Aaron Dillard willing to do for a few $1,000s? Ruin people's lives. And you've seen what Aaron Dillard was willing to do to get out of years of prison. When Aaron Dillard got to the Kenosha jail on August 14th, 2007, he immediately recognized Mark Jensen. He knew about him from articles, he knew it was a high-profile case, and within 30 minutes he was talking with him. That's how quickly Aaron Dillard found his mark. And what did Dillard claim? He basically talked nonstop with Mark Jensen about his case. The evening of the 14th, all day on the 15th, all day on the 16th. He said that Mark Jensen shared the transcript of the Klug hearing and then talked all about his case. He said that Mark protested his innocence all evening of the 14th. He said that Mark protested his innocence all day on the 15th. And then on the 16th, Aaron Dillard said, you know, we all did something to get here. And Mark said, yeah, and then gave him a full confession. Do you remember the 7-hour interrogation by Detective Ratsberg? You were shown 45 minutes of it. Highly trained interrogator. I guess if only Detective Ratsberg had said, come on, right? Aside from just how unbelievable this story is, the prosecution bought it completely. Dr. Mainland bought it. Dr. Chambliss bought it. Mark Jensen was charged in 2002 with homicide in this case. Then in 2008, after hearing about Aaron Dillard's claim, they changed their opinions. Dr. Chambliss went from undetermined to asphyxia by smothering. Dr. Mainland went from ethylene glycol poisoning to ethylene glycol poisoning with probable terminal asphyxia. Why was everyone so willing to be victimized by Aaron Dillard? I think it's because the science and the evidence don't support the theory that Mark Jensen killed Julie Jensen with ethylene glycol. I think it's because it makes no sense that if Julie Jensen was paranoid and not eating or drinking anything from Mark, that then she'd suddenly eat and drink everything he gave her. And according to Doctors Chambliss, Mainland, and the prosecution, where could Aaron Dillard have learned these details? We're not wondering that anymore, are we? On August 11th, 2007, 3 days before Aaron Dillard showed up, Mark Jensen received 2 oversized envelopes from his attorney. In those envelopes were the transcripts of Ed Klug and the interrogation of Mark by Detective Ratsberg. Now, you heard from Nathaniel Clanton. Nathaniel Clanton's time in J Block actually overlapped a little with Aaron Dillard. I think he said he got there on August 16th. Nathaniel Clanton explained how Mark Jensen handled himself in the jail. He said Mark had 2 bins of paperwork. Mark would freely discuss details and share that paperwork with other inmates. He'd share his police reports. He'd freely share his case files. Nathaniel Clanton explained that Mark would even share this with the people that were only there for a few days. And Nathaniel Clanton did more than that. He explained what an awful idea it is to share your information in a jail. People will use it against you. They'll take the information, they'll twist it, they'll add some lies, and they'll make it look like you're confessing to something you didn't do. Mr. Clanton explained that happens quite a bit in jails. When Detective Ratsberg interrogated Mark Jensen, he told you that he was trying to come up with different scenarios to get Mark to confess. Detective Ratsberg had the autopsy, and he was trying to make his scenarios fit what he thought were the autopsy findings. He testified to that. You heard Detective Ratsberg's imagined scenarios that he proposed to Mark Jensen. Her arm was actually here. I'll show you how she was, okay? Her arm is actually across her body like that, okay? And it's an unnatural position. Do you sleep when you're on your side with your arm across like that? I know there was some type of contact there. There had to be in the chest, this chest area, Mark. There's no question about that. And the only person that could have done that was you. I'm thinking before you left, you pushed on her maybe. Now, she was frail at the time. She was frail. You said she was labored breathing. That makes sense, and I believe that. Okay, I know that probably happened, but she's frail. And you just innocently, I don't want to, pushed her like that. And could that have caused something? I mean, we have petechiae of the lungs. There's some type of contact here in the throat. There's also been an indication on the throat, as I showed you in Dr. Chambliss's report. It just did not appear there. Something and somebody had to touch her. That's the only way it could get there. There's no doubt about that. And did you push her, touch her on the throat maybe? Maybe like this? Maybe when you brought her over this way, you pushed her back on the chest and then went back and brought her up again. You know, you would have pushed her back. We still have to explain the nose part, the head pushed into the pillow. How are we going to explain that? I mean, that's there. Something had to push it down. There's three things that happened here. Head being pushed, the nose, some type of contact here at the throat, and some type of contact here in the chest. We know that happened, okay? You were the only one there. You had to do something, Mark. Dr. Mainland acknowledged, testifying this time, that Aaron Dillard could have gotten those details that made up his claim from this transcript. She agreed that Aaron Dillard's claim was not found in the Klug transcript, but was found in Detective Ratsberg's claims in the interrogation transcript, and that those claims lined up with the autopsy report. The prosecution has insisted, though. They keep insisting. Aaron Dillard denied reading anything except for the Klug transcript. Well, his claim would be a lot less convincing if he admitted to making it up. Can you trust what Aaron Dillard says when a decade of prison is on the line? Can you trust him when $50 is on the line? Dr. Mainland said she wouldn't buy a used car from Aaron Dillard. Does Aaron Dillard give you pause? To me, it warrants slamming on the brakes and never wanting to engage with the man in any way. We have to look further because his story has some reveals. Look closely at it. He said that Mark wishes he hadn't opened his stupid mouth around his coworker about him wanting to kill his wife. That's what's fucking him now. That's what Aaron Dillard wrote. So the person who allegedly regrets saying something to Ed Klug while maintaining his innocence, while denying that he ever said anything to Ed Klug, would then open his mouth and offer a full confession to the person that you're saying these things to? That doesn't make any sense. Aaron Dillard says, on a Tuesday, he took her to a doctor. That's a small detail buried in his statement. But we know from Dr. Borman that Julie came alone to that doctor appointment. He first describes Julie Jensen on December 2nd as just throwing up a little. He then changes it to really just vomiting. There's no vomit anywhere. And when she died, her stomach was full. He says that Mark came home and that Julie Jensen was breathing better. But we learned from Dr. Hale, the only one who testified in this courtroom that was qualified to discuss ethylene glycol poisoning, the only toxicologist you heard from. As long as a person is still processing ethylene glycol, they'd be in phase 2. Their breathing wouldn't get better. They'd be trying to get rid of that, to blow off that carbon dioxide. And because Detective Ratsberg isn't a forensic pathologist, he proposed an asphyxiation death, but didn't take into account that there were no marks or injuries to the inside of Julie Jensen's mouth when what's described as shoving her face into a pillow until she asphyxiated. He didn't take into account that nothing was aspirated, nothing was regurgitated, There are no injuries on her back. Would you buy a used car from Aaron Dillard? His story is a lie meant only to benefit himself. When he created his story, he had over a decade of prison that he used this to reduce to 0. Now, he's got even more at stake. He's facing decades in prison right now, and he's getting another letter from the prosecutor, which is the same thing he got in 2008, resulting in no time for lying to that officer. Would you rely on Aaron Dillard for anything except to lie? I want to talk about the autopsy. Dr. Michael Chambliss wasn't the medical examiner for Kenosha County. He came down on December 4th to do the autopsy. He did his autopsy report, and then he did nothing else with the case. He didn't review reports. He didn't send things out for studies. I think he said he didn't even review the toxicological results. He did an autopsy, and then he turned it all over to the medical examiner's office, and his role was done. That autopsy was in 1998. I think the faxed autopsy report was in February of 1999. The person he turned it all over to, Dr. Maureen Lavin, we never heard from her in this trial. A side note, even though Dr. Chambliss, even though the only report he ever did said that the cause of death was undetermined, he felt pretty comfortable in court giving an opinion to cause and manner of death without having done that investigation that a medical examiner does. Do you remember Dr. Lindsay Thomas testifying? The renowned and respected forensic pathologist? The prosecution attacked her because she didn't know the acronyms Mark Jensen and Kelly Labonte used in their emails. But Dr. Chambliss, he told you that his involvement in this case and his investigation was done at the time he issued that preliminary report. So what did he note and how did he explain it? He agreed that Julie Jensen had a substantial amount in her stomach. He agreed there was no way of knowing how long it was in there. It was very likely she had delayed gastric emptying. He identified petechiae in the cardio area. He found no injuries to the insides of Julie Jensen's lips and cheeks. He found no fluid in the nose. There was no aspirated food in the respiratory system. He found zero evidence of external forces to the chest. He found zero evidence of trauma to the abdomen. There were no rib fractures. And then he identified a small amount of hemorrhage involving the soft tissues and muscles attached to the left, second, third, and fourth ribs. Remember this theory that exists that from Aaron Dillard that this grown man climbed on top of Julie Jensen's back and forced her lungs to close. Set aside whether the evidence actually established that this hemorrhage was just post-mortem lividity or congestion since Julie Jensen was lying on her side. And set aside for a moment that the picture actually just shows darkness on all the ribs on that side of the body, demonstrating that this is just congestion. Dr. Chambliss even said this could be post-mortem artifact. He testified he doesn't know when this injury, if it even is an injury, even occurred. He said it could have been caused by bumping into something. And then he was asked whether Julie Jensen's death could have been positional asphyxia, whether she had gotten herself into a position and she couldn't breathe. And he said no. And the reason he said no is he said, because that wouldn't explain the hemorrhage on the ribs. This is the very thing he just had testified could have been caused by bumping into something, could have been post-mortem artifact. And if it was a hemorrhage, he was unable to say when it occurred. But then the reason he rejected the idea that Julie Jensen might have gotten herself into a tough breathing position is that it didn't explain the very thing he agreed had several completely innocent explanations for. I don't know what to do with that. That's confirmation bias. That's some sort of circular logic that does not belong in a courtroom. That's wholesale reliance on Aaron Dillard. Even with that, then Dr. Chambliss agreed that if Aaron Dillard's a liar, then Dr. Chambliss's cause and manner of death would be undetermined. Science didn't lead to Dr. Chambliss's opinions. He made the science fit the story told by Aaron Dillard. Dr. Mainland also, she says, that could be hemorrhage, it could be congestion, I don't know what it's from, when it's from, could be postmortem artifact. After Aaron Dillard, it's hemorrhage, it's terminal asphyxia. She said she wouldn't buy a used car from Aaron Dillard. I'm sorry, but that says all you need to know about how Dr. Mainland's use of the phrase to a reasonable degree of medical certainty. In its opening statement, the state called Kelly Labonte the motive. Excuse me. Throughout this case, how many times did we hear about the cruise they were planning? At some point, she described to Mark Jensen all the men she had ever been with. And yesterday, when Mr. Jamboys was cross-examining Dr. Sarah West, he argued these four things. He said, Mark Jensen and Kelly Labonte had an affair, and they had made a plan to go on a cruise in 1999. Kelly Labonte then divorced her husband. Then Julie Jensen died. Isn't that convenient? Do you remember those questions? Well, the problem is the chronology is completely off. They had an affair. No one's contesting that. Julie Jensen had an affair. Mark Jensen had an affair. I'm not saying that makes them even or something, but these affairs happened, and it's not being contested by us at one bit. Kelly Labonte talked about divorce. And then Kelly Labonte called off the affair with Mark Jensen. And buried in all the emails that were presented in this case, on October 27th, 1998, Kelly Labonte says, I did realize I need to give this a fair shot or get the hell out. I've decided to give it a fair shot first. A 6-year relationship that I fought tooth and nail for and a 1-month marriage deserves at least one bold effort. Anyway, I would very much like your support on this. I need to focus on the positives of this marriage and see what happens. Mark's response? You've always got my support. That was October 27th, 1998. Kelly Labonte called off the affair in October. She ultimately left her husband. That was in January of 1999. and then she got divorced in March or April of 1999. So this argument, how convenient for Mark Jensen that Julie Jensen died after this divorce from Kelly Labonte with her husband, it's changing the facts to fit the narrative. It's clear that this marriage was in trouble well before Mark Jensen had his affair. This marriage was in so much trouble that when Julie Jensen had her affair, she actually filed for divorce in 1991. I want to talk about Ed Klug. Think of how unbelievable Ed Klug's testimony is. How unbelievable he is as a person. The Blueprint Conference was in November of 1998. Julie Jensen died a month later. Over 3 years went by, and he reached out to the police department because he had something to say. And what did he have to say? That Mark might have used a computer in the Appleton office, but all the computers have since been changed out. That's it. That was his contribution. And nobody cared. 5 more years went by, and we're now 9 years from when Julie Jensen died, and Ed Klug gets contacted. And Ed Klug suddenly has a much more interesting story for the prosecutors. You know what? A month before Julie Jensen died, Mark Jensen told Ed Klug, someone he did not have a personal relationship with, that he was looking up ways to kill his wife. Now, in 2007, he had no notes of this. He testified he didn't have notes of this. He testified he didn't write anything down. He had no notes of any conversations or any details. In 2008, he found the notes. This is one of them. They don't say the words ethylene glycol or antifreeze, but that's what he remembers Mark told him. Why didn't Ed Klug come forward? He says it's because Mark was his boss. But Mark wasn't his boss in 2002 when he reached out to the police to tell them that Mark had used a computer. Ed Klug testified that when he called his wife at 2:34 a.m., he told her that Mark Jensen was talking about killing his wife. According to this note, and to his story, Dawn Cooper was present. Near the bottom, Mark unloaded on us. So what did Dawn Cooper say? She remembered sitting with Ed Klug and Mark Jensen in the hotel lobby after bar closing. She was going through a divorce, and they were saying supportive things to her. She remembered Ed Klug leaving to call his wife. She said there was no conversation about harming wives. She said there was no conversation about anyone using a computer to look up ways to harm a wife. She was no longer working at Stifel in 2002 when Mark got charged in this case. She testified she got a call from Ed Klug, and he said nothing about any conversation in 1998. Dawn Cooper got contacted by the prosecutors in 2007, or by the investigation. And the way she was asked about it is consistent with what Ed Klug says, that she would have been present for that conversation. And she knows it never happened. She would have remembered that. Stacy Bauer, she worked in the Appleton office. She came here and made an assertion that she heard this from Ed Klug. She also acknowledged having read about Ed Klug's testimony. And remember this, what's on the screen? That's her written statement from August 10th of 2007, which says, quote, "I have no knowledge of a conversation Mark had with Ed Klug in St. Louis regarding killing his wife," end quote. Ed Klug says that Mark was talking about a website called howtokillyourwife.com. In all the computer stuff that we've heard, have we heard anything about howtokillyourwife.com? Joan Wise was Ed Klug's longtime assistant. Do you remember that Ed Klug claimed he told all staff on the Monday after the conference about this conversation? Joan Wise says that never happened. She never heard anything about Mark Jensen from Ed Klug, except that Mark Jensen's wife had died and that she had committed suicide. That's what she heard from Ed Klug. Ed Klug never said that Mark Jensen talked about killing his wife. She gave us her opinion about Ed Klug's honesty. He's not a truthful person. Her knowledge about his reputation, you can't believe a word he says. He's an attention seeker. Ed Klug's testimony about his drunken night in 1998 is just not believable. Ed Klug is not believable. This issue of David Thompson, David Thompson acknowledged that prior to talking to Mark Jensen, he wrote a letter to his fiancée saying, "It's time to help myself." And everything about David Thompson is consistent with this, that David Thompson came up with a proposal, a crazy proposal, that somebody would be held for 6 weeks for $1,000, that he communicated that proposal to Mark Jensen, and then it's also very clear that no money ever exchanged hands. Now, you heard some phone calls. You heard some recorded phone calls between Mark and his parents. And the one that I had played, the couple that I had played, predated the ones that he was calling, where it was a three-way call with David Thompson. And you can hear the intimidation in Mark's voice. And he's talking about, "I need you to do this or I'm going to have a fight on my hands." You heard that advice from Nathaniel Clanton. Nathaniel Clanton said, "This would be the dumbest thing you've ever done," or something like that. And he said, "Beat your case fair and square." It seems like Mark took that advice because no money ever changed hands. There's this sort of peripheral theory that's been floating around in this trial, that in November of 1998, Mark Jensen had tried to kill Julie Jensen with ethylene glycol. And the only reason that this exists is because of Aaron Dillard. Now, we know that Julie Jensen threw up all over the carpet and didn't clean it up. And we've heard all about what ethylene glycol poisoning is. We didn't hear really about it from the state's witnesses. Like I mentioned earlier, no toxicologist. Their experts were Dr. Chambliss, who didn't review things, and then Dr. Mainland. But here's what's interesting about this claim, is Julie Jensen was at home with the kids. And with all the conversations and reports to the neighbors, the Voights, and with all the phone calls to Dr. Borman when there was the slightest sickness in that household, and with the statements about the paranoid statements about maybe being poisoned or being drugged or somebody's out to get me. There's nothing about this incident. There are no reports to Dr. Borman. There's no reports to the Voights. There's no report of breathing problems. There's no report of intoxication. There was no poisoning in November. I'd suggest that this vomit all over the carpet that wasn't cleaned up, that might be indicative of something else that was going on. Julie Jensen used the computer and she used the internet. We know this from Laura Koster. Laura Koster was an IT expert. She said that Julie Jensen used the computer and used the internet. We know this from her son, David Jensen. We know this from the Quicken software that she used when Mark was out of town. We know this from the resume she created on the computer. There's this statement from Therese DeFazio that Julie Jensen said she didn't know how to turn on a computer. And then there's a little bit more of an explanation. And Therese DeFazio talked about clearing out the cache or checking the cache. And the clarification is that Therese DeFazio, at school, they had Macs. Could that have been why Julie Jensen didn't know how to turn on the computer at school? Because at home, they weren't on just their first computer, and they had IBMs. Now, set aside the problems with the investigation. The computer wasn't write-blocked when Detective Ratsberg insisted it be turned on, and the corruption of the files that can be caused by that. Now, the state said, when they looked through these different websites, they said, we know it was Mark on some days because the website was for Bass Pro Shops and for a cruise. They looked to context to say who would have been on these sites, who would have been looking at these pages. Well, the interests of Julie's and the context of these websites tells us what was going on. This October 16th, the recipe link, a message board for cooking recipes, botulism. Who was the only one who did any cooking in the Jensen household? On October 16th, after 11 p.m., there's an access to the Stifel branch listings. An email between Mark and Kelly Labonte from earlier that day. And then there's a search in Stifel for a Kelly, no last name. Mark Jensen knew who Kelly Labonte was, and he knew how to email her, and he knew where she worked. Julie Jensen knew who Kelly Labonte was. She knew of Kelly Labonte. This is the cover. This is the first page of Julie Jensen's day planner. And you see on the upper right corner, it says Kelly Labonte. And this lines up with what Ted Voigt said, that about 5-ish weeks before her death, that Julie Jensen knew that Mark was having an affair. The prosecution needs this to be Mark Jensen because there are searches for mercury fulminate and nicotine. The prosecution needs it to be Mark Jensen, or else it shows that Julie Jensen accessed the computer late at night. On November 10th, 1998, suicide message boards. A search for suicide, a search for physician-assisted suicide. I don't know why anyone clicks on different links after doing a search. I don't know how long Julie Jensen stayed on the page of physician-assisted suicide, but there's only one person in that house that would have been searching for suicide with what we know about the context of what was going on with Julie Jensen in those last couple of months. Look at the internet searches on December 2nd that Ms. McNeil showed you. 8:16 a.m. through 8:38 a.m. An article on ethylene glycol poisoning, oxalic acid, fomepizole, toxic alcohols, a page on how patients with toxic alcohols present, the dangers of ethanol substitutes, ethylene glycol, specific poisoning information. We heard about SSRIs from Dr. Hale, I think, and also Dr. West about the risk of certain medications and how they can ironically increase somebody's risk at suicide. The prosecution needs this to be Mark. But on December 2nd in the morning, Mark took Douglas to daycare. That was at 8 a.m. And then he went to Dr. Borman's. And after meeting with Dr. Borman, a prescription was written, and Mark Jensen took that prescription to Walgreens, where he waited for it to be filled. That was around 11:13 a.m. These searches at 8:16 a.m. to 8:38 a.m., all about ethylene glycol, it had to be Julie. On December 3rd, you have searches late at night, and then in the morning, 9:40 a.m., toxic alcohols, ethylene glycol poisoning, a page on diabetic ketoacidosis, 9:42 p.m., 2 minutes later, back to the Yahoo search results for ethylene glycol poisoning. I think it was the state's first two witnesses in this case, Ruth Vorwald and Shannon Krause. 9:30-ish, they saw Mark driving. He wasn't at home. These had to be Julie. Mark had gone to pick up a check from a client. Then later he said that he stopped in the office. Now, Detective Ratsburg waited over 3 years to interview anyone at the office. And 3 years later, after Mark had been charged, they said they didn't see him that day. Well, the police searched all of Mark's property. They searched his briefcase, they searched his office. The check that he went and picked up from the client, that wasn't found at the house. This is the problem with memory. It's the problem with waiting years to talk to people. Now, we know from Dr. Hale about the late stages of ethylene glycol poisoning. There is no scientific reason that she would have been unable to go to the office and do a basic internet search. We know her body was producing urine, and there was no urine or any fluid in the bed. Julie Jensen was able to get up and go to the bathroom. We know from David Jensen that his mom hugged him and spoke with him that morning. You know what's interesting is there are no searches on this computer for Ambien, Paxil, Librium, there's paroxetine, Librium, Benadryl. No searches for divorce, right? That point's been made. Even though we know Julie Jensen was planning on getting a divorce. We heard that yesterday, that after the holidays, she'd be getting a divorce. Nothing like ethylene glycol or poisons or drug interactions were ever found on Mark's work computer. And this claim that he fried that computer is nonsense. They recovered that computer and they analyzed it. So, who was Julie Jensen? We heard from witnesses that Julie Jensen was a lovely human being. We heard from witnesses that she was a devoted mother. We have no reason to doubt either of those characteristics. But you can be lovely and you can be devoted to your kids and you can be mentally ill. And Julie Jensen was mentally ill. She had a major depressive disorder and was at high risk of suicide. Sometimes it's hard to put a finger on what we're supposed to believe about Julie Jensen. Was she meek and vulnerable? Did she need Mark's permission to discuss their kids' medical issues with a doctor? Was she constantly under the thumb of her husband, being controlled by whatever he wanted? Was she so naive that in 1998 on their second home computer that she didn't know how to turn one on? Did she need Mark to explain to her why she was feeling intoxicated on December 2nd? It sure doesn't seem that way. She was a straight A student. Chemistry, human physiology, death and dying, pharmacology, psych abnormal behavior, genetics. Those transcripts were admitted into evidence. She had her Series 7 brokerage license. She created a resume. After she had her own affair in the Jensen home with their 1-year-old in the house, she was the one who sent Perry Tarika packing and told him never to call or contact her anymore. That's not meek. We heard about her counseling in 1990 to 1991 with Paul DeFazio. She decided she wasn't happy with the progress. It wasn't going fast enough. And so she called and said she was going a different direction. That's not meek. When she fell in love with Perry Tarika, she got a lawyer and filed for divorce. She was in charge of the family finances. You've heard how she used Quicken on the computer. Her best friend, Laura Koster, the IT specialist. Laura Koster looked to her for how to use Quicken. Laura Koster confirmed that Julie Jensen used the computer and used the internet. When the private investigator, Dave Ellis, when he told her that the photos left at the house weren't her, she told him he was wrong. And she told him she didn't want his services anymore. When Perry Tarika sent her a letter with clipped out articles and cartoons, Julie Jensen called the police on him. Julie Jensen made decisions for herself. Now, the prosecution has advanced this theory that Julie Jensen was made to believe she'd lose the kids if they got divorced. I don't know where that claim comes from. She had a lawyer when she filed for divorce in 1991. She asked for full custody in that filing. According to Jill Polera, she was about to file for divorce again. Laura Koster said Julie didn't need Mark's permission and didn't need Mark to tell her what to do. Laura Koster would go to Julie Jensen with medical questions. But Julie Jensen did have some serious, long-standing mental health problems. And here is where I think the photos and the phone calls are actually relevant. We know that on June 29th, 1990, Mr. DeFazio, the psychotherapist, met with Julie Jensen. She had a new son. She'd been married for 6 years. He identified the possibility of limited postpartum depression. She described her mom's problem with alcoholism and said that there was a family history of depression. Mr. DeFazio testified that Julie Jensen was experiencing some obvious mental health issues. He diagnosed her as adult situational reactive with mixed features. He noted features of depression and anxiety. She told him she had a very unhappy childhood and was not happy whatsoever. Now, in July of 1990, she described getting little support from her spouse at home. In September of 1990, seasonal depression was noted. 2 weeks after that, they discussed an antidepressant and he referred her to a psychiatrist. She was prescribed Prozac. The psychiatrist, Dr. Newman, described her as crying all the time, having no appetite. She used to enjoy cooking, and now it's just a chore. Those are the notes. Chronically depressed, cries easily. Mr. DeFazio explained that with depression, things that used to give pleasure just don't anymore. Now, I mentioned in June of 1991, Julie Jensen canceled and said she wanted a different therapist, that progress wasn't going fast enough. She never told Mr. DeFazio about the affair. Mr. DeFazio made no referrals and did not know if she saw anyone else. Now, throughout this time are the hang-up calls and the issues with photos left at the house. I don't know what to make of the hang-up calls. Her log lists a lot of them. There's this narrative from the prosecution that it was Mark and that when there'd be a trace, the calls would stop. We've heard that. It's false. We looked at the logs. We went through this. The vast majority of the hang-up calls were out of area. And in the 90s, I guess they couldn't trace those. The calls kept coming in while the traces were in effect. We've seen that in the logs. I went through those with Detective Ratsberg. Detective Ratsberg testified that out of area meant out of state. Mark's work phone was a 262 area code. The prosecution's argument that Mark was gaslighting Julie with hang-up calls, we know that because of the traces, is just simply false. The less than thorough investigation of Perry Tarica as being the source of the calls, they called and asked him and he said it wasn't him. Were these just normal hang-up calls? If they were, was this just more paranoia and perceived harassment? So what about these photos? Perhaps we can consider what evidence there actually is about these photos. What was actually described in all of those police reports to the House? The reported leaving of photos was sporadic. And Julie Jensen was convinced it was her in the photos. What Detective Ratsberg wrote, when I spoke with Julie last, she mentioned to me that she and Mark had sexual problems, and she stated that the photos, which normally showed her having contact with a man's penis, is something Mark wanted to do, but she refused. The photos were described as showing her. They were described by Julie Jensen as showing her. Now, Julie Jensen is a smart person and presumably would know if these pictures were of her. Now, despite testimony that there was a bag of evidence turned over and all the photos. All that was retained was a single photograph that by its description was unlike any of the others. This one was on actual photo paper. It had, I think, like a Kodak stamp on the back. And the picture looked nothing like Julie Jensen. Maybe the other ones didn't look anything like Julie Jensen, but the other ones were described as being on copy paper. These were never fingerprinted, although Detective Ratsburg acknowledged that they could have been. We heard from the secretaries that worked with Mark in 1998. They denied opening any mail that had pornographic pictures. But Detective Ratsburg confirmed that the only claims about getting photos in the mail at work were in the early 90s. Here's what else we know. They were all destroyed. So these pictures that Mark Jensen is accused of leaving around and sadistically torturing Julie Jensen with, there's no evidence for us to look at. Now, Mr. Jamboys asked Dr. West yesterday. He asked her this question. If Julie Jensen knew that she was being sadistically, psychologically tortured by Mark Jensen, would that suggest that her perceptions of reality in her stated fears were not distorted? First, Julie Jensen consistently denied everyone's suggestions that it might be Mark leaving the photos. She fired Dave Ellis, the investigator, when he made that suggestion. She insisted to Officer Kosman that they were her. So, if it was truly obvious that these pictures weren't of her, what does that say about her mental state that she just insisted that they were? Now, the next doctor reports that we have are Dr. Borman's. And he was her doctor from the mid-90s until Julie Jensen died. And she called about so many things. She called when Mark Jensen had washable marker on his face. She called if there was a cough in the family. You heard us go through these records. But in September of 1998, at that appointment, she brought up the family history of depression. She was concerned about her mom's history. She was tired. She had been prescribed Prozac before. Dr. Borman diagnosed her as having mild depression. At that visit, she weighed 123.5 pounds. In the fall, Laura Koster was talking with Julie Jensen outside while the kids played around them. And Julie showed Laura a photo of a list and a plastic syringe and asked her what she thought. And to Laura Koster, the person who knew her best and was her best friend, nothing seemed odd about what she was being shown. But what she noticed from this was the unsureness and the oddness of the question. And then Julie, while the kids were playing around them in the driveway, mentioned she thought Mark was going to kill her. And Laura Koster told her she didn't see it at all and was absolutely stunned by the suggestion. But she said, if you feel you're in danger, come with me and we'll make sure you're safe. Laura Koster knew Julie Jensen better than anyone, and she said that Julie Jensen wasn't scared. She said Julie Jensen, in that conversation, had extraordinarily flat emotion for the topic of that conversation. You heard about on November 29th, there's a search for antifreeze. And then on November 30th, Julie was at karate practice and talked with Laura Koster again. This is the week that Douglas was starting full-time daycare. And Julie said she'd be going to see a doctor and be treated for depression. That she was going to see a doctor that week and be treated for depression. And then she said she wasn't going to be at karate for the next few days or at the next time. She said Laura wouldn't be seeing her for a few days. Laura described her as unusually emotive, that Julie Jensen hugged her and it was like a goodbye. And then Dr. Borman saw her on December 1st, 1998. He fit her in. She was alone at that appointment. Dr. Borman explained that Julie really didn't want to be labeled as crazy. She was miserable. She was depressed. She had decreased appetite. She had lost nearly 7% of her body weight from the previous visit. She denied any issues of domestic violence. She was distraught and in tears. She declined counseling. She denied being suicidal. She denied being homicidal. Dr. Borman had never seen her like this. On December 2nd, Mark Jensen came and expressed his concern about Julie's sleep issues, and Dr. Borman gave him a prescription for some Ambien. Now, the prosecution seems incredulous that Dr. West thought that the prescription of Ambien was not based solely on the word of Mark Jensen. She opined it was necessarily filtered through the information from Julie Jensen the day before and previous visits which suggested major depression. I mean, we can look to the September visit where being tired, fatigue was noted. I want to talk about Julie Jensen's perceptions of reality. And I want to consider the wildly inconsistent statements of her. To Therese DeFazio, Mark wouldn't let her get a job. He was controlling. To the Voights, Mark is pushing her to get a job, and she doesn't want to. To Ann Lynch, she has to get a job because her marriage is in the toilet. To Laura Shore, she was actually offered a job and had a start date when she hadn't been offered a job and didn't have a start date. To Therese DeFazio, Mark always turned off the computer or covered it quickly. To the Voights, she'd walk past the computer screen and see poison on the screen. Mark would leave for work, and on the computer screen was a website for poison. I mean, I want to go through all of these, but on that one, right, like we heard about dial-up internet, and we heard about when these searches were. And so was the computer just logged on onto this website for 9-10 hours? To Ann Lynch, she said nothing about the computer. To Therese DeFazio, she wanted to put Douglas in all-day school, which is a special program for normal kids to mentor kids with special needs. To the Voights, Mark is making her put Douglas in daycare and she doesn't want to. To Ann Lynch, she was upset and crying about needing to put Douglas in daycare full-time and wanted to know if they had space. All of these statements are basically contemporaneous with each other. That Post-it note that we keep hearing about, where did it go? Julie was the one that took a picture of it. In the moment, the people that she showed it to, the people that knew Julie Jensen, who knew the context, who knew what her complaints and concerns were, they looked at that Post-it note, and how did they react? They thought it meant nothing. Think about some of Ted Voigt's testimony in this case. Evidently, he thought that Mark Jensen had killed Julie Jensen. And then when he was asked to describe that office, he didn't recognize it. I don't know if you remember this from the video. He didn't recognize it because when he had been in that office, later, things had been moved around. He was in that office after Julie Jensen had died, sitting there with Mark while Mark was helping him with stocks. So this neighbor who thinks that Mark Jensen was out to get Julie Jensen is then over there getting stock trading help from Mark Jensen in that office. You know, the thing about that, leaving the computer on so that when Julie would be vacuuming or walk by and she would see what was on and the door would be 3/4 closed. We saw a picture of that room, and we talked about this, I think it was when Detective Ratzberg was testifying about the scene photos. And we saw a picture of that room and the location of the computer and where the door was and how the door closed. And if that door was 3/4 closed, no one would be able to see the computer screen. That list, that Post-it note, that's such a big deal. It says DeFazio, Terry on it. Well, how does that play? How does Therese DeFazio play into this scheme of Mark Jensen's? It said Nicotrol. Didn't the state say that that was prescribed to Mark? Is this like all the other lists that got talked about, and what does this mean? What do these letters mean? And then we learned from Dave Naring that they were stock symbols. And here we are 25 years later trying to assign meaning to these little nuggets of information when we know the meaning of these nuggets of information because the people who lived in that moment and knew her the best looked at it, and we know how they reacted to it. I want to talk about the offers of help that Julie Jensen received and declined. Ted Voigt offered to give Julie money and she could use his cabin, and Julie declined the offer. Therese DeFazio offered to set up Julie with a women's shelter. Julie declined and said her neighbor was working on getting her a place. But when that happened, she had already declined Ted Voigt's offer. Laura Koster offered to give Julie a place to stay with the boys and not allow Mark at the residence if Julie was actually concerned. She also said, your brother lives a couple of miles away. Take the checkbook and the boys and leave. Julie didn't call her brother. She didn't leave with the boys. She didn't take the money. She had her own car. Officer Kosman said, if this is real, go to the shelter if your life is in danger. She declined. You know, the state's wrong. We aren't suggesting that Julie Jensen was framing Mark Jensen with these statements about fear. These were paranoid misperceptions of reality. One of the things that Dr. West explained to us yesterday is she said that a person at high risk of suicide creates space for themselves to be able to follow through. She said she sees that in suicide cases. Julie Jensen created that space for herself. Her conversation with her best friend, Laura Koster, on November 30th. You're not going to see me for a few days. On December 2nd, she wrote the note to Therese DeFazio that she wouldn't be seeing her. Her conversation with Margaret Voigt on December 2nd. You won't be seeing me, don't worry, I'm fine. I want to take a look at the last 2 weeks of her December calendar. Well, actually, yeah, if you go back, these are some calendar pages in November. And they're full of things. And then when we go to some pages in December, there's nothing. Julie Jensen was aware of what she was doing. She was creating space for herself, like Dr. West described. Now, the science, we didn't learn about the science and how ethylene glycol poisoning works from the prosecution. We learned that from Dr. Hale. And the blood levels tell us nothing about whether something is a homicide or a suicide. Dr. Mainland thought it's a homicide because it's hard to get someone to drink a fatal dose, and so it would have to be multiple lower doses. But then we learned that this little NyQuil shot was all that would be needed for it to be a fatal dose. And then there's nothing in Julie Jensen's toxicology that suggests this was anything more than a single fatal dose on the night of December 1st to the early morning of December 2nd. Now, the person educated in pharmacology who Laura Koster went to with questions about medicine, she didn't need Mark to explain side effects of Paxil or paroxetine. We learned about a person's mental faculties and their abilities while processing ethylene glycol. We learned about what Julie Jensen, the person educated in pharmacology, informed her neighbor on December 2nd that she was fine, it was her new meds, and Mark was going to the doctor for her. She knew that Mark Jensen was going to Dr. Borman's for her. Now, that doesn't really fit with this idea that he's got this scheme and he's involuntarily administering medications and she doesn't know what they're for, and he's forcing her to take these things and he's drugging her against her will. We learned about the high likelihood that the half a teaspoon remnant of ethylene glycol in her stomach was just that, a remnant of a prior dose. We also heard from Dr. Mainland's extraordinarily questionable study. But the blood levels tell you nothing. But you know what was interesting about her study? Is that almost every ethylene glycol case that she could find was a suicide. That's sad, and it's what happened here. Mark Jensen did not kill his wife. We know this from the science. We know this from what Julie Jensen told her physician. We know this from when Julie Jensen said goodbye to Laura Koster. We know this from the description of David Jensen and how distraught and grief-stricken his dad was. Now, the prosecution has one more chance to get up for an argument. They'll have their rebuttal argument. I'm not going to have a chance to answer that. So this will be the last you hear from me in this case. Please think about the questions we've asked of the witnesses in this case. Please think about what my answer would be to the state's argument. This case is tragic on so many levels. There's depression, there's suicide, and there's an innocent man on trial for homicide. Mark Jensen is innocent, and we ask you to return a verdict of not guilty.